name is Robert Polhamus III. In the summer of 2012, I was hired by SUNY Orange and the Purple Heart Hall of Honor to research 19 soldiers from Middletown that fought in the First World War. My first thought was that I was happy to be working. My second thought was that a local history project was probably not going to be that interesting. But the more research I did, the more I dug, and the more in tune with the lives of these 19 men that I became, I realized that there was a story that had to be told. This story, like any other one that comes out of the First World War, is drenched in heroism, perseverance, and tragedy. On September 29, 1918, the men from Company I, Middletown, New York, sieged the last German stronghold known as the Hindenburg Line. A contemporary author called the Hindenburg Line a 1,000-mile steel stretch of chain that was used to enslave humanity. It was up to the boys of Company I, 27th Division, along with British and Australian forces, to break this line. Most of the information collected for this project came directly from primary sources, newspaper articles written before, during, and after the war, or personal letters that came directly from the front or from family members. Because of the importance of morale, the War Department actively censored the letters that were coming from the soldiers in France. The articles printed in the Middletown Times Press were beautifully stylized and designed to play up the patriotic role of the soldiers and not focus on the brutality. The information has to be taken with a grain of salt. Anyone who knows the truth about the Hindenburg Line, about the Somme, about the gas-filled trenches, know that this war was bleak, that it was dirty, and that it profoundly affected the lives of millions of people the world over. Although mostly a European conflict, Middletown, New York was not spared from being part of the throngs of mourners. November 1918 was defined by weeping widows, mothers who would never again see their son's face, and fathers witnessing the end of the family name. Over the next hour, you will meet 19 men who perished on the fateful day of September 29, 1918. You will see their faces, you will hear about their lives, and you will witness their lives extinguished. A discussion of these men is also a discussion of Middletown, New York in the early 20th century, and the morals that defined Orange County, New York at that time. This presentation is also a tribute to Middletown, New York. It is a story about a city whose demographics changed forever and would learn how to cope in the pitiless winter that followed the ceasefire. Even after the horrors of this war changed Middletown forever, the city, just like the boys on the front line, had no choice but to cry forward. Although this was less than 100 years ago, please keep in mind that Middletown, New York was located in a drastically different United States of America. This is a time before the Great Depression and Social Security, before Prohibition, and before women could vote. Television was a dream of science fiction writers, and mass-produced penicillin had not yet revolutionized medicine. In 1918, the life expectancy for men was 53 years old, for women was 54. People identified themselves by ethnicity and were classified by race. At best, groups were labeled as colored, Indian, Irish, Chinks, or Japs. The acceptance of these racial epithets is evident by their use in periodicals. Socialism was a buzzword that most people in this country used as a synonym of Bolshevism, and by association, cruelty and godlessness. Record keeping was barely a profession, and data collection was not the obsession that it is today. Surviving birth certificates are rare, and certificates of marriage are next to non-existent. The U.S. Census of 1910 more closely resembled its ancient Roman ancestor than the modern version. These documents were only as good as the penmanship of the census taker. Anyone who has seen censuses of that period knows that they were rife with mistakes. While Europe was thousands of miles away, Americans were listening intensely to global politics. The war had been going on since 1914, when the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Serbian nationalist terrorist organization known as the Black Hand. At the time of the assassination, Princip was only 17 years old. Such an insult to the ruling classes of Europe, this event ignited a global war that had been brewing for decades. At the end of the 19th century, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy signed the Triple Agreement, creating what would be known as the Central Powers. Not to be outdone, in 1907, France, Germany's sworn enemy to the West, and their ally England signed the Triple Entente with Russia, effectively encircling the Central Powers. Because of nationalist disturbances and Russia's alliance with Serbia, the powder keg, which was the Balkans, threw the world into war. The old empires of Europe finally had a reason to settle old scores and usher in a new era of dominance. The poster child for German aggression, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was the grandson of England's Queen Victoria and the cousin of the last Tsar of Russia. The Great War was, in a sense, a twisted family reunion. These lavish blue bloods never thought that a good old-fashioned dust-up would turn into a modernized, mechanized, global horror. Germany would find itself on a suicidal two-front war, the likes of which the world had never seen. When war erupted in 1914, the United States attempted to remain neutral. Isolationist foreign policy was encouraged by Congress, who feared that the melting pot population of the United States was also a powder keg ready to explode. It was once again a case of assimilated immigrants fearing the new wave of immigrants. Congress also feared intrusion. Europe was still the epicenter of the world, and entering the war would give other countries political entry into U.S. policies. The U.S. was heavily saturated with propaganda. Much of the material had a pro-British slant, which was aided by the connection to Britain as our cultural brother. While propaganda sympathetic to Germany also existed, it did not carry much weight with the American public. Germany was seen by most Americans as a dangerous monarchy with totalitarian, militaristic worldviews. The Hun was a favorite of the U.S. press. Ironically, this nickname was coined by the Kaiser himself in order to motivate German troops. Paranoia sparked by U-boat attacks and the Zimmerman telegram, Americans began to see war as inevitable. In a now famous speech, President Wilson asked Congress for permission to go to war. On April 6, 1917, war with Germany was officially declared. President Wilson justified the United States' involvement in the European theater through the use of the iconic words, an act of high principle and idealism, and as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. This was the whirlwind of world politics that was buzzing in the streets of Middletown, New York. But in 1915, most people in Middletown would never dream that Europe and destiny would come knocking on the door in 2 short years. During the 20th century, Middletown, New York was a farming and factory city. A 1911 estimate puts the population in Middletown at 16,000. Walking in downtown Middletown, we can see the remnants of the production facilities that drew thousands of people here in the early 20th century. While these buildings struggle to find new owners, they stand as a monument to the prosperity that Middletown once housed. the existence of the Ontario and Western Railroad and the Erie Railroad attracted production facilities to the city. To build New York City, trees were being imported from upstate New York and parts of Canada. The sawworks, in conjunction with the railroads, made Middletown instrumental in the construction industry. Most of the men mentioned tonight worked directly for one of the railroads or in one of the production facilities in Middletown. Other than rail work, popular sites of employment were the Howell Hinchman Tannery and the Monhagen Sawworks. The Monhagen Sawworks had been erected in the 1860s at the height of the logging industry. In 1916, Middletown, the war, prohibition, and suffrage were the hot domestic topics. At this time, cities and counties were individually voting whether to go wet or dry, meaning to prohibit alcohol or not. For those of you wondering, Middletown voted to go dry, while Newburgh opted to stay wet. Scrolling through the Middletown Times Press or the Orange County newspaper, there are plenty of articles about suspicious Germans who were picked up on a litany of trumped-up charges, which could be as benign as conversing in their native tongue on trains. This article was about two Germans who were handed over to police by a citizen who claimed he heard them speaking seditiously. The police held the men without charge. Even before the United States entered the war, joining the state militia or the U.S. Army was another option for young men in search of purpose or career. The Army promised adventure and to be part of something much bigger. Some men joined the armed forces for financial reasons, for civic duty, or just for the excitement. The illustrious regiment that these men joined was the 107th. The 107th was the restructured version of the old 1st and 7th Infantry Regiments of New York State. The 7th Infantry has a particularly rich history. The 7th was created in response to the firing on American ships by the British off the coast of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Previous to the War of 1812, the 7th participated valiantly in declared wars and was also used domestically. The 7th was nicknamed the Silk Stockings Regiment because of its disproportionate number of wealthy sons from the Upper East Side of Manhattan. During the years that led up to the First World War, the 7th Regiment was merged with the 1st Regiment from upstate, which included Middletown and Newburgh, to create the 107th. The 0 was placed between the 1 and 7 to symbolize that there should be nothing keeping the men apart. While the country boys teased the rich kids about being prissy, the Upper East Siders thought the Orange County folk to be coarse, uneducated bumpkins. Teasing aside, the men of the 107th learned to understand each other and become one of the most effective fighting forces in the war. 2 companies of these apple knockers had been mobilized 3 months before the war was declared to protect the aqueduct that supplies New York City with water from the Catskills. Former governor of New York, Charles Whitman, a somewhat paranoid man, was convinced that saboteurs could easily cut off the supply of water to New York City by attacking the aqueduct. Sabotage of this nature could make New York susceptible to rioting, or even being completely razed. History has justified the acts of Governor Whitman, as several sabotage plots, such as the explosion at Black Tom, were eventually attributed to German saboteurs. Those men who joined the ranks before the war and were on aqueduct duty were known as members of Old Company I. This term was a point of distinction as those who volunteered to serve before the declaration of war. Company I was composed mainly of Middletown boys and those from the immediate area, including Bullville, Goshen, Wallkill, and Port Jervis. It was part of the iconic 107th Regiment 27th Division. Because of social organizations, churches, and centralized employment, the boys of Company I likely knew each other even before joining the ranks. Some of the men were from established families in the area, while others were first generation or had wound up in Middletown for employment or as the result of fortune. During the First World War, companies and regiments of the armed services were generally organized by geographic location. This organizational style harkens back to the state militia. The attitude motivating the preservation of this type of organization was the idea of commonality. Soldiers who knew each other, had grown up together, attended the same schools, and had similar occupations would work better as a unit. Basic training for Company I was done at Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where the men trained in all manners of modern war. There was rifle practice, machine gunning, bayonet training, preparation for gas attacks, and simulations of trench life for 24 to 72 hours at a time. It was here that the men started to distinguish themselves and were designated their individual positions. Some became riflemen, others were selected to man the coveted Lewis gun. Others became orderlies or joined the sanitation detachment. Sanitation detachment is an archaic term for the medics who patched up the wounded on the field. Sanitation duty, a position to be proud of, was also a very grisly job. Military medicine was still in its nascent stages. A World War I field hospital more often resembled those of the Civil War than those of World War II. Despite what lay ahead, the letters that came home from Middletown, from Spartanburg, resembled letters home from summer camp. They were cheery, upbeat, and with just the slightest tinge of complaint, usually of marching to and fro in full equipment. Listed here as what each man carried throughout the war, totaling 40 pounds. Brimming with enthusiasm, Company I departed from Newport News, Virginia, on the good ship Susquehanna on May 10, 1918. The men of Company I were individuals as well as soldiers. They grew up, went to school, got jobs, and started families of their own. Even before sailing to France, Company I received the reputation of being a tight-knit, diligent, and humble unit. It is my esteemed pleasure to introduce you to 19 members of Company I, who all gave their lives on a single day of battle, September 29, 1918. These young men, whom were all under the age of 30, sacrificed their own futures for ours. Aaron Wesley Doolittle was born in 1900 to Benjamin and Lizzie Doolittle. Aaron was one of 4 children, 3 of which survived. When the family moved to Middletown in the early 1900s, Benjamin supported his family by working at the Monhegan Saw Works. Benjamin and Lizzie were both native New Yorkers, which was somewhat rare. Among these 19 men, usually one or both parents were born outside of the United States. Irish and German lineages were the most common among the group. Aaron lost both of his parents while in his teens. Records indicate that the family remained self-sufficient. Aaron took a job managing the lawn of George M. Clemson, who owned a very impressive tract of land on Highland Avenue. Clemson was the owner of Monhegan Saw Works and would have been one of Middletown's wealthiest men. During Middletown's production boom, Highland Avenue housed some of Middletown's wealthiest residents. We're standing on what is now the YMCA in Middletown, and this property used to belong to George M. Clemson. Clemson was a wealthy man who had many servants. Among the servants was a lawn tender named Aaron Doolittle. Aaron joined the Army at the age of 16 and was on aqueduct duty as a member of the old Company I. While on furlough in the following spring, the 17-year-old corporal returned to Middletown and married the just as young Ethelyn Plattner Kine. Their home was listed as 7 Wallkill Avenue. The newlyweds would not be able to spend much time together. The last time the young couple was together was in port at Newport News, Virginia, as Doolittle waved goodbye on the Susquehanna. Horace Murtha was born in 1895 in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. The Murtha family moved to Middletown shortly after his birth and made their home at 20 Benjamin Avenue. He was the eldest son of Andrew Murtha and Julia Kennedy, both Irish. He had 4 sisters and a younger brother named Thomas. He attended Middletown public schools and was an active member of the Holy Name Society of Mount Carmel Church. Horace worked at the Howell Hinchman Tannery and later was in charge of the stockroom for the Ontario and Western Railroad Company. Horace also joined Company I in 1916 before war was declared. He was close with his extended family, writing frequently to his cousins during his time in service. The family of Horace Murtha was close with the Anderson family, whose son Seymour was also in Company I. Seymour Anderson was a Middletown native, born July 12, 1899. He was a middle child, the son of James and Helen Anderson, formerly of Pennsylvania, as well. Seymour had a younger sister, Edith, and an older brother named John J. Anderson, who also served in France. Their address was 8 West Main Street. At the age of 17, Seymour located to Waterbury, Connecticut, to work in a munitions factory until war was declared. At 18 years old, Seymour followed his brother into the service. In situations like this, it would have been Seymour's choice to enlist in Connecticut or Middletown, but Seymour's connection to the city that raised him caused his immediate return. It is unclear whether Horace Murtha's family and Seymour Anderson's family ties go back as far as their time in Pennsylvania, but documentation shows that their mothers were especially close. They, like many other mothers, shared the bond of having young sons serving their country half a world away. In 1916, with the increase in the size of the military, boys and men between the ages of 16 and 30 all contemplated entering the service. In order to attract potential soldiers, companies would put on demonstrations or parades. Such a demonstration took place on June 20, 1916. Men of Company I Sanitary Detachment marched on North Street of Middletown. Two members of the crowd who watched this display of patriotism were Edwin Ronk and Cornelius F. Mann. Wrapped up in the excitement, Edwin and Cornelius signed up for service that very day. Edwin Ronk was born in 1896 to Charles and Mary Ronk. He was an only son but had 7 sisters. The Ronks were working-class people. Edwin's occupation was listed as laborer, and his 2 sisters were employed as picker and the other as a box maker. His address was 6 Monhagen Avenue, Middletown. Edwin joined Company I in 1916 and was part of the old Company I, and soon found himself guarding the aqueduct. The other excited onlooker, Cornelius F. Mann, was born in 1898 to Georgiana Van Aken and her first husband, who died when Cornelius was an infant. Georgiana remarried to Joseph B. Mann, and the family took the name of their stepfather. In the census records, Joseph's occupation was listed as condenser, most likely working at the Borden's condensing factory on Canal Street. At the age of 18, Cornelius joined the army. Also like Ronk, Cornelius was an only son. He had 3 sisters, Nellie, Oneida, and Sarah. Their address was 80 Sprague Avenue of Middletown. Cornelius was civic-minded, participating in many community organizations. He was a member of the Phoenix Engine Company, a junior member of the Wallkill Council, and volunteered at the First Baptist Church. Cornelius's occupation was listed as school. Both Edwin and Cornelius were eager soldiers. They were both single and joined the ranks before they had a chance to start families of their own. Floyd M. Carter was born in 1895. He was the eldest son of a large family and had at least 5 sisters and 2 younger brothers. He was a lifelong resident of Orange County, born in Slate Hill, and lived in Otisville, just outside of Middletown. He enlisted with Company I on May 21, 1917, after the declaration of war. The Carters were a military family. His older brother was a member of Troop E of the 8th U.S. Cavalry, located in Palvo, Texas. The stir created by the Zimmerman telegram, or the recent escapade with Pancho Villa, could explain why Carter's brother was in Texas, to protect the U.S.-Mexican border. Earl Winter was born in Woodbourne, Sullivan County, in 1896. His father died early and his mother remarried and moved to Goshen. Their address was 43 Montgomery Street. He had 2 younger sisters, Eva and Jenny. Earl would have worked side by side with Horace Murtha at the Howell Hinchman Tannery, who was an active member of the Wallkill Engine Company. Earl's birthday was September 21st, which means Private Winter spent his 22nd birthday hiking the countryside in France. Little did Private Winter know that in a little over a week, he would be dead. Around the 3rd week in September, the attitude of the men began to change as stories of the dreaded Hindenburg Line began to filter in. William C. Dunlap was the son of Clarence and Lillian Dunlap, 27 Lake Avenue, Middletown. When William was 18 years old, he signed up for Company I on August 28, 1917. Signing the roster right beside him was his 17-year-old brother Felix. Both boys were eager soldiers, and it ran in their blood. William and Felix's grandfather was a well-known Civil War veteran who lived at the Lake Avenue address with them. William and Felix would have grown up listening to heroic tales of the Civil War, which undoubtedly instilled in them a rigid sense of duty. The Dunlaps came to embody the spirit of Middletown, young, exuberant, and willing to stand for something. The Dunlaps were given lots of press, becoming symbols of Middletown's patriotic and can-do attitude. The Brothers in Arms, as they were known, were local heroes even before their deployment. Jesse Leon Marriott also worked for the New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad. He was born in 1897 and was the only child of John and Emma Marriott. Jesse was very involved in the North Street Congregational Church and is said to have missed only 2 sessions of Sunday school in the 7 years he attended. He joined Company I on March 17, 1917, 3 weeks before the declaration of war. He was an avid writer and sent a flurry of letters home to his family. Jesse found his calling as a rifleman, attaining the distinction of expert and one of the best in the division. He sent his rifleman's pin home to his mother, who received the letter glowing with pride. Another O&W man, George Fred Short, was born circa 1891. His home was in Bloomingburg, but due to his employment, he had a host of friends in Middletown. He was an active member of his church, helping with the Sunday school service as well. His father died at the age of 37, and his mother Martha remarried. George joined Company I in 1916 and attained a furlough in December of 1917. He was united in marriage with a young schoolteacher on December 27, 1917. Her name was Mary Horning, and she taught for several years at the Beatty Hill School and the Albert Street School. Just like the Doolittles, this young couple would spend more time apart than they would together. Charles Shaneberg's story is a little different than most of the other men because he did not serve with Company I and did not live in Middletown or the surrounding area. He was born in Greenville, New York on January 24, 1894. When he was 6, Charles was orphaned and he went to live with his aunt in Port Jervis, New York. At the age of 21, Charles left the area to work at the Edison Electric Plant in Harrison, New Jersey. Perhaps more geared toward career instead of military service, Charles's story again differs in the sense that he was drafted, while most of the other men signed up voluntarily. Because of his different location, Shaneberg was a member of Company G of the 810th Infantry Division. Perhaps because of his drafting, Charles could not enter Company I, or because of his talent, he was exported to another unit. The Mid-Times Press published an article regarding the amount of friends Charles had in Middletown. For this reason, and the circumstances of his death, Private Shaneberg is listed alongside his fallen comrades. There are several soldiers on this distinguished list who have little to no legal records and very basic or missing obituaries. The details of Albert Walters and Peter Toroano's lives remain mysterious. Walters had a small obituary in the Mid-Times Press that gave only a small glimpse into the man's life. His article was standard for a soldier, saying that he was fearless in the face of the enemy. Instead of listing relatives, the article only mentions that his employer was notified of his death. His obituary states the nebulous fact that he was from the West. His military records list no next of kin, and his family as not known. What is known is that Albert Walters was in Middletown, New York during the enlistment period. The story of Private Walters tells the story of a traveler. He left his home, most likely in California, and traveled east, doing odd jobs before joining the ranks in Middletown. He left no roots, had no connections, and this conjures up the image of a man thirsty for adventure. Walters probably jumped at the chance to explore France with the friends he had made working in Middletown. Regardless of the reasons behind his decision, Albert Walters died on the line on September 29th, side by side with the other Middletown boys. The case of Albert Walters is tragic in the sense that there was no family to mourn him, no grieving mother or widow. Although menial, enough information exists to get a feel of Albert Walter's personality. Peter Toroano did not leave enough information even for speculation. Perhaps his name was misspelled or changed or his dog tags lost. Toroano had no obituary, no birth certificate, no census information. Only a signature on a draft card and a name on the casualty list remains to show this man ever existed. In a sense, Peter Toroano and those like him were the greatest casualties of this war. Not only did the war rob them of a future, but the lack of records robbed them of a past as well. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the highly documented stories of childhood friends turned soldiers, Job V. Jackson and Aloysius McMickle. Job Jackson was the eldest son of William Jackson and Florence Vanenwagen. They lived at 184 Highland Avenue in Middletown. Private First Class Jackson was young, dashing, well-educated and popular, a true Middletown Renaissance man. Job played clarinet in the orchestra of the First Street Congregational Church, was also the second assistant foreman for the McCoy Engine Company. He joined the service and received training as a member of the Sanitation Division. Job's position as a field medic could mean he had aspirations of entering professional medicine after the war. Although busy in the community, Job Jackson found time to fall in love and marry a young woman named Florence. When Job sailed for France, he left behind a pregnant wife and a daughter he would never meet. Grace Jackson was born in June of 1918, about the time her father was landing in France. Aloysius McMickle, or just Al as he liked to be called, followed the same path of his friend Job before, during, and after the war. Al was a member of a large family, the son of John C. McMickle and Mary McEntee. He had at least 4 sisters and 2 brothers. Their home was 19 Albert Street. While he was also a member of the McCoy Engine Company, Al preferred basketball to the orchestra, playing on various teams in Middletown. Al and Job joined the Army together, went through all the same camps and training, and both became field medics. Those who knew the pair were so moved by their bond that they often appeared in letters home from camp or from France. While Job and Al's attachment was harmonious in life, their mutual end would take on a much greater symbolism, putting the enormity of the war in perspective for Middletown residents. Russell Miller was born in 1889 to John and Mattie Miller, who owned a farm. He had one sister, May, and the family was native to Bullville, New York. Russell embodied the kind and well-mannered demeanor one would expect from an Orange County farm boy. Previously to joining Company I, Russell was employed at a metalworks factory in Waterbury, Connecticut. A small article about Russell Miller was printed on May 23, 1916, stating that although he was recently employed at the metalworks factory, he returned home to care for his ailing mother. She recovered and Russell returned to Connecticut to work until he joined his compatriots of Company I. The newspaper was also a means of expressing recognition for those who upheld the bonds of honor and tradition. Russell always put family first, and this was noted by his friends and neighbors. He wrote home more often than any other soldier mentioned. Unfortunately, it would be Russell's ailing mother who survived the war and not her devoted son. Chadwick Giroux was also another farm boy turned soldier. Chadwick was the son of Joseph Giroux and Jenny Hathaway. He had at least 3 sisters and 3 brothers, and they lived in Blooming Grove, New York. The Giroux operated the High-Low Farms in Blooming Grove and had been established in the area since the mid-19th century. Chadwick was one of the most senior members of Company I. He joined the armed forces before 1916 and had attained the rank of sergeant. While more mature than the other men, Sergeant Giroux was still only 28 at the time of his death. Chadwick was an active member of the Blooming Grove Church, first constructed in 1758. The story of John E. Terwilliger is an interesting one and a nightmare for genealogists. As it turns out, Middletown had 2 John E. Terwilligers. One man was originally from New Jersey and may have been living in Middletown during the time of the enlistment. The other was a longtime resident. Both men joined the army and were sent to France around the same time. Due to the similar names, it was very difficult to determine where one man's story ended and the other began. The Middletown Times Press pooled both men into one figure. It would take the press and the U.S. government over a year to straighten out the case of mistaken identity. John Company I was the only son of Fanny and Hiram Terwilliger of 33 Horton Avenue. John had 2 or 3 sisters, though this was also not clear. William Joseph Nolan, or Bill as he was known, was born on December 6, 1894. He was the son of Michael and Mary Nolan, and the eldest brother of Mary, Anna, and Francis Nolan. He was educated at St. Joseph's Parochial School and lived at 71 Prospect Avenue. A man who enjoyed working with his hands, Bill was employed at a cigar shop for 2 years before becoming a roofer. One of Middletown's large production facilities was the Nathan D. Mills Cigar Shop on Anthony Street. He enlisted in Company I in July of 1917. When in France, Bill became an orderly for a lieutenant. William Nolan was extremely well liked by the men of Company I. Others wrote about his cheerful disposition and winning smile. The impression left by William Nolan is an optimistic type, perhaps not suited for the harshness of war. William's naivete may have led to his particular demise. These are the men, along with hundreds more from Orange County, New York City, and from the country that departed from Newport News, Virginia on the good ship Susquehanna on May 10, 1918. They arrived in Brest, France on May 23rd. From there, the boys moved inland by train car. The cars had a holding capacity of 40 men or 8 horses per car. The soldiers complained that the horses had usually been shipped first. Despite the unhygienic transportation, the mood of the company and the entire regiment is one of curious excitement. One of the Middletown boys even sent a French grenade home to his younger sister, which was put on display for the public in a Middletown window. After a British guide led the troops astray for a time, the company first starts hearing the big ones, or bombs exploding in late July. As they marched on, the men came across their first war-wrecked town, that of Steenvoorde. The village had been completely dismantled. In a story recounted from a letter, the boys seemed unfazed by the carnage. The letter states that the soldiers noticed a stunning church that had a massive hole blown in it. Curiously exploring, they found an uninjured pipe organ among the wreckage. Perhaps through some nervous energy, the boys sang American hymns late into the night. So far, for Company I, war was an escapade. The excitement and adventure promised by the recruiters was becoming reality. The boys wrote home about the pristine French countryside, and conversely the surreal imagery such as flattened towns and holy churches. For the next few weeks, Company I, along with British and Australian forces, marched toward the Hindenburg Line. Late August turned to early September. The men would see some light action, but by no means would be engaged in open warfare. In the first few weeks of September, the men hung about an area known as the Bond sector of the French countryside. This area would be characterized by grateful French townspeople and plentiful food. The problem is that this oasis would not sustain the men for long. Orders came down in mid-September that they were to march toward the dreaded Hindenburg Line. They were to meet the 105th and 106th and take the line. This area would stand in stark contrast to where the battle would actually take place. While this is characterized by lush greenery, that area would be completely stripped. There would be no plants, no people, and it would resemble more of a graveyard than an actual field. The American surge of the summer of 1918 was designed to deal the death blow to the German army. For years, the Germans and the French had been trading control of this area. The most famous battle of the war, the Somme, claimed millions of lives but made territorial gains of only a few hundred yards. In 1917, as Russia dropped out of the war, Germany concentrated its forces on the Western Front. The impossible two-front war suddenly became a single-front assault. They made gains in their spring offensive, known as the Kaiserschlacht of 1918, but failed to secure supply lines and coordinate efforts. The Allies saw these disorganized German troops as sitting ducks and launched a massive counteroffensive known as the 100 Days Offensive. Germany was pushed back, relinquishing the gains they had made during the Kaiserschlacht. With the defection of Bulgaria and the loss of Greece in the south, Germany was now without food supply and surrounded. The German army was now a caged animal, and it was up to the Americans who had the duty to slaughter the beast. The Hindenburg Line was the American and English term for a series of fortifications, trenches, tunnels, machine gun nests, anti-tank ditches, and barbed wire designed to be the last line of German defense. It consisted of 3 lines, each named for a German mythic hero. The goal of the Allied assault near the ruins of the Guillemot farm was to capture the Willow Trench and occupy a canal that both protected the German soldiers from artillery and allowed them to move freely through the canal. The fortifications were simply too well designed. Every time a machine gun nest was cleared, Germans were able to restock the nest using the tunnel and canal system. Allied troops were cut off whenever they tried to push beyond the line. This system inflicted massive casualties on the Allied forces. When the 107th arrived on September 27th, they saw the bloody and battered men of the 105th and 106th Divisions. The boys of Company I, still innocent to the horrors of this war, wrote their last letters and finally started to realize the gravity of the situation. At 4 a.m. on September 29, 1918, the 107th, along with the 105th, 106th British and Australian forces, launched into a battle against a grizzled mass of as many as 6,000 professional German and Prussian soldiers, utilizing a nearly impenetrable defense. No description in word can portray the hell that these men had to endure. This is a hell that makes any account by Dante or Milton seem trivial. This was not supernatural, but a man-made inferno. The dark of night would have been only pierced by signal flares and the fire from exploding casings. Ringing in their ears, the men could only hear the incessant rattle of the Lewis guns and the deafening pounds of shells. The only human noises would have been that of confused yelling and screams of absolute agony. It would be impossible to know whether the cries were coming from fallen comrades or dying enemies. These men's last breaths would have tasted like dirt, sulfur, and the coppery tinge of blood. If this account seems dramatic, I assure you it is not. This was the dying vision of 1,000 that day. The fighting was fierce and bloody, but after incurring severe losses, the Allied forces breached the Hindenburg Line and sent the Germans in a panicked retreat through Belgium. This singular event, where the myth of the invincible Hindenburg Line was obliterated, truly signaled the end of the Great War. Back in Middletown, New York, letters and cards from the time spent in the Bond sector and before that were arriving in mailboxes. Over the next few weeks, the headlines were telling Middletown families that the Hun was through and that it was the 107th that was mainly responsible. The newspapers spoke about heavy casualties, but the letters were still coming home. Parents, wives, siblings, and friends were starting to breathe a sigh of relief. The murmuring in the streets was about the war being over, and that it would just be a matter of time before the next letter came. While the headlines may have comforted some, others began to worry and sought out word. Slowly, information about individual soldiers began to filter back into Middletown. These 19 men of Company I met their demise together on a single day and for a singular cause. Due to eyewitness accounts and military briefs, the last moments of each man's life can be accounted for. On November 8, 1918, the same day that the Mid-Times Press declared that preparations were being made for a victory parade, the first wave of horrific news hit Middletown. During the early morning hours of September 29th, Private First Class Job Jackson and Private First Class Al McMickle were killed. The story surrounding the death of these 2 men is very dramatic and bittersweet. Inseparable since before the war, Job and Al shared a hometown, an occupation, a thrilling adventure, and an untimely death. The following story is a summary of dozens of letters and articles that described the details regarding the deaths of these 2 soldiers. As the sun rose on September 29, 1918, men were going over the top into no man's land, and were going down just as quickly. Working as a team, McMickle and Jackson were tending to the soldiers on the field, patching up the wounded while dodging machine gun fire. They had briefly taken refuge behind an embankment to cover themselves and the men they were working on. They heard a long whistle, and then out of the sky, a German shell hit just above the embankment. The ground caved in, and the two men were buried alive. Other soldiers attempted to help, but as it was described, the ground just opened up and swallowed them whole. There was no chance of survival. This sight was so overwhelming to the men who witnessed it that it stands out as a common theme among dozens of letters home. A heartbreaking but appropriate end. The two comrades slept together in the same grave forevermore. Joe Jackson would never again see his new wife or meet his infant daughter. While the deaths of Jackson and McMickle were unequivocally confirmed, others hearing news got vague answers. Such was the case of Chadwick Giroux on the same day as Jackson and McMickle. Sergeant Giroux of Blooming Grove was reported either wounded or dead. It would take weeks to get a definite confirmation. Every day from November 8th on would be filled with a gamut of emotions for those waiting to hear from loved ones. The headlines were getting more and more positive, assuring the public of German surrender at any moment. But simultaneously, the military dispatchers were coming around with special telegrams and sad tidings. For the next 6 weeks, good and bad news continued to flow into Middletown. The famous date of the ceasefire was 3 days after Middletown learned of the fates of Joe Jackson and Al McMickle. While the official armistice would take months to work out, the fighting stopped on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The entire United States exploded in celebration. There were victory parades, parties, music, bonfires, and Kaiser Bill was being burned in effigy and dragged through the streets. Wet towns got wetter, and dry ones stamping their feet as well. The town had become an ongoing festival as the parties continued and shops had victory sales. People frequently attended the movies. Comedies would have been popular given the celebration. Movies that may have been showing would have been short films starring Charlie Chaplin and A Dog's Life or The Bond. Fatty Arbuckle and Buster Keaton had The Cook and The Bellboy out. The post-war ecstasy and celebration was enough to allay the fears of some people waiting to hear from husbands, sons, or cousins. But in only a few short days there would be more bad news. The next shockwave would come on November 13th at the height of the celebration in Middletown. The sobering reminder of the horrors of war hit the mothers of Horace Murtha and Seymour Anderson simultaneously. The two women were attending the moving pictures together when a relative broke the news to both women that their sons were never coming home. The Middletown Times-Press told the story of two inconsolable women who wept openly in each other's arms for a great while. They had been under the impression that the fighting had stopped and their sons were safe. The Mid-Times-Press reported that the news hit the two women like a bolt from the clear blue sky. After a time, Seymour Anderson's mother received notice that her son received a divisional citation for gallantry and bravery. While this is a great honor, no award can console the loss felt by a mother. Middletown newspapers gave Horace Murtha great praise in his obituary. He was described as morally and physically ideal and a cheerful, manly boy. The obituary ended with a segment of the popular poem My Creed by Edgar Albert Guest. It read as follows: "To leave some simple mark behind, to keep my having lived in mind. If enmity I ought to show, to be an honest, generous foe. To play my little part nor whine, that greater honors are not mine. This, I believe, is all I need for my philosophy and creed." Mothers and fathers quickly realized that the end of the war was not a guarantee of safety for their boys. Nervously, they waited by the door for a telegram or a trench card, hopefully postmarked September 30th. The news of two more men claimed by the Hindenburg Line came on November 15th. On that day, Jesse Leon Marriott and William Nolan were reported killed in action September 29th. Emma Marriott, Jesse's mother, had heard a rumor of her son's death back in August. In her own stoic words, she told the Middletown Times-Press that she would not worry until there was something to actually worry about. Jesse was an avid writer, sending many letters which allowed her to dismiss the rumor, but the letters abruptly stopped. Jesse did a mass mailing on September 22nd to most of his extended family, including his parents and a host of cousins. It would be the last they heard from him. Jesse died while going over the top, right beside Seymour Anderson. When the dust had cleared, both men were found within yards of each other, lying amidst many dead Germans, their magazines empty. They fought to the last bullet, taking as many Huns with them as they could. Marriott received a divisional citation based on this fact alone. Discussed within the citation, Marriott was distinguished as being one of the best Lewis gunmen in the company, and while no one survived to tell of Marriott's battlefield heroism, the place where his body fell was well within enemy territory as a display of his courage and determination. As I watched the censuses of Marriott's home, I was sobered to see that Jesse's parents took on boarders for the next 20 years, perhaps renting out the room of their son who would no longer come home to it. I followed the trail for almost 2 decades. Boarders would come and go, and then suddenly all records ceased. William Nolan was the orderly for an unnamed lieutenant. As the lieutenant was cut down immediately after going over the top, Bill took the initiative of leading the men himself. Seeing his lieutenant fall, in a rush of adrenaline, Nolan exclaimed, "Come on, boys, I will lead you over the top." And the men followed. But Nolan himself was shot several times after only a few yards. Bill Nolan, the optimistic, good-natured cigar maker, sacrificed himself to get the unit over the top. November 16th was very similar to the 15th. Front page of the Middletown Times-Press featured 2 more dead Company I boys. News of Edwin Ronk and Floyd Carter hit the community, and celebrations gave way to communal mourning. Edwin Ronk joined Company I after the parade through Middletown, being caught up in the patriotic display. One can only imagine the loss felt by Edwin's 7 sisters as they heard about their only brother dying in the Great Push on that fateful day. Both Corporal Ronk and Private First Class Carter received citations for great courage and determination in action. The standard telegram that was the specter of stoops and front porches of many Middletown residents read as follows: "Deeply regret to inform you that your son is officially reported as killed in action on September 29th. 18 simple words in exchange for a human life." On November 19th, the names read as follow: Albert Walters, killed in action. Felix Dunlap, died of wounds. Albert Walters had no family. While the deaths of men like Al McMickle and Seymour Anderson, who had large and known families in Middletown, we find that their deaths were front-page news. Conversely, news of Private Walters' death was printed near the back of the newspaper, next to a much larger article entitled, "Steadier Hog Markets Planned." Walters received a citation regardless that there would be no family to recognize it. Private Walters received a divisional citation for courage and determination. Felix Dunlap of the famed Dunlap brothers was featured on the front page that day. News of the death of Cornelius F. Mann and Aaron Doolittle broke on November 20th, 1918. The barely 21-year-old Corporal Mann, who, along with Corporal Edwin Ronk, joined up after watching the men parade through the city of Middletown, died while attacking an enemy trench. His divisional citation for courage and determination described how Private Mann pushed through barbed wire in the face of terrific machine gun fire, and with great resolution. The civic-minded Private Mann, who participated in a variety of public service positions, fell that day serving his country in the most profound way. While this young man seemed to have the qualifications for leadership in public office, his participation on the battlefield exemplified true leadership. On this same date, the 18-year-old wife of 19-year-old Corporal Aaron Wesley Doolittle received a telegram that her husband had been killed on September 24th. This information conflicted with the letter she had received from her husband, dated as late as the 26th. Ethelyn reported this back to the War Department, who would not clear up the matter for several months. This telegram was a mixed blessing. While Ethelyn knew that this telegram was wrong, it did not necessarily mean that Aaron was safe. The letters had stopped. but she and the community held out hope. On November 22nd, Middletown was rocked when it learned of the deaths of Earl Winter and William Dunlap, making both Dunlap brothers casualties of the war. Private Earl Winter was a member of the Wallkill Engine Company, which drew particular attention to him. Private Winter also left behind two devoted younger sisters who, for the next 20 years, would take out ads in the Middletown newspaper to pay tribute to their older brother, who died in the prime of his life. Year after year, between the dates of his birth, September 21st, and the date of his death, the 29th, the ad would grace the pages of the Mid-Times Press until war with the Germans broke out once again. While Winter did receive a divisional citation for courage and determination in action, the memorandums left by his sisters more accurately show how the character of this young man affected those around him. Both Felix and William Dunlap were serving as members of Company I. William fell during the Great Push on September 29th, but Felix survived the battle. The fighting continued as the Germans retreated. The battle-scarred members of Company I were on their trail, but the fighting became desperate. Allied forces chased the Germans well past the Hindenburg line. While it is not certain that Felix witnessed the death of his brother, he would have surely known William was missing, as William was the company clerk. On October 20th, Felix was wounded and sent to a field hospital. A nurse, perhaps moved by the story of a mother with two sons fighting in the same theater at the ages of 17 and 18, took it upon herself to write Mrs. Dunlap letters regarding Felix's condition. Felix survived for 2 days in the field hospital. Unfortunately, Mrs. Dunlap received 3 letters on the same day. The first confirmed that her elder son, William Dunlap, was killed in action on September 29, 1918. The next letter was from Sister Dady, the nurse caring for Felix. The second letter said that the boy was in serious condition and that he spoke about his mother a great deal. The third and final letter she received was from the same nurse and the hospital's chaplain, explaining that Felix had died from the gunshot he received to his leg. Evidently, the whole hospital had taken a shine to the young boy, who remained cheerful despite his agonizing pain. The brothers in arms, the symbols of Middletown's unity, had now become symbols of sacrifice and loss. In tribute, the Middletown VFW post was named after the Dunlap brothers. During World War I, there was a clerical distinction between those who were considered killed in action and those that died of wounds. Killed in action was a special designation for those who were killed in open combat, those that survived long enough to be taken back to a field hospital. Even those who survived only the distance from the front to the medics were designated as died of wounds. This is why William Dunlap's name appears on the honor roll plaque and not Felix. Because of the connection shared by the brothers and their relationship with Middletown, Felix Dunlap could not be left out of this presentation. A few weeks passed with no news of death. The families of Russell Miller, Aaron Doolittle, George Short, and Charles Shanneberg were still waiting for confirmation. On December 10, 1918, there was an extremely small obituary for Charles Shanneberg, the boy who lost both parents and lived in Middletown for a short time before moving to New Jersey and working in the Edison electric plant. On December 14, 1918, the death of Corporal Russell Miller was finally confirmed. Due to backlogged letters, the Miller family was still receiving mail from Russell as late as October, while the last letter was dated before September 29th. Seeing their son's handwriting after hearing about so many other boys that had died must have given them hope. In mid-December, the family knew for sure. According to a first-hand account from another soldier on the field, Corporal Miller was last seen with a shot through his stomach and was laying unconscious in a shell hole. He was beyond help. Corporal Miller received a citation for great courage and determination. In a horrific twist, on December 27, 1918, the one-year wedding anniversary between Corporal George Fred Short and his young wife Mary Horning, she received the news that her husband had been killed in action. Their short marriage was an experience in fret, fear, and worry. Again, Corporal Short received a citation for his participation in the taking of the Willow Trench, but to a grieving newlywed, it must have seemed hollow. The young wife of Corporal Aaron Doolittle would have to wait even longer than Mary Horning. Ethelyn Doolittle did not receive confirmation of her husband's death until mid-January 1919, 4 months after the battle. On January 14th, she was finally given the news that her husband's body lay in a military cemetery in France. It was said that she never gave up hope and believed that the initial reports of Corporal Doolittle's death had been a mistake. In situations like those of Mrs. Short and Mrs. Doolittle, the newspapers usually took it upon themselves to interject patriotic messages at the end of these sad articles. Corporal Doolittle's article ends with a blurb saying that Mrs. Doolittle was happy because she knew her husband believed that there was no sacrifice too great to give on behalf of liberty and justice. Last on the distinguished list is the curious case of John E. Terwilliger. As it turns out, there was a private first-class John E. Terwilliger of Newfoundland, New Jersey, formerly of Middletown, New York, and there was a Sergeant John E. Terwilliger of Middletown, New York, the son of Hiram and Fanny Terwilliger of 33 Horton Avenue, Middletown. On June 23, 1919, almost 9 months after the Battle of the Hindenburg Line, the War Department sent Mr. and Mrs. Hiram Terwilliger a letter saying that previous reports of the death of John E. Terwilliger was not their son, and that the similarity of names and addresses had caused confusion. This reignited hope in the couple that their son may still be alive somewhere, perhaps wounded in a hospital. As it happens, Elmer E. Johnson, a former resident of Middletown, was working in Washington, D.C. as a government worker and heard of this story. He used his connections to investigate and clear up the matter. Upon scrutiny, it was discovered that both men died on September 29th in different parts of France. While this was not the answer the Terwilligers had hoped for, they were at least granted closure and took solace in the fact that their son was instrumental in the smashing of the Hindenburg Line. Among the bodies also lay a man named Peter Toroano, supposedly of Central Valley and from an unknown company. To this day, mystery still swirls around the man who fell among the rest. After the dust had cleared, it became evident that the 107th Division, including the boys of Company I, were instrumental in breaching the last German stronghold known as the Hindenburg Line. According to historical accounts, the division advanced so fast that they ran the risk of being hit by their own artillery shells. The cost was heavy. The 107th suffered more killed in action and died of wounds than any other regiment in the division. Among them were the 19 soldiers you met tonight. While this presentation focused only on those killed in action, there were hundreds who returned to Middletown, bringing home with them the memories of those who gave their all. Middletown, New York contributed directly to the end of World War I by participating valiantly in a task that was thought to be impossible. These are the stories of the men from Middletown whose names grace the Orange County Honor Roll. While the city of Middletown went to great lengths to honor these men, after a few generations, they simply become names on a wall. This presentation was designed to give these men back their own personalities, and in turn, to rehumanize them. On a personal note, I spent 18 months with these men, trying to experience exactly what they experienced. I saw them grow up, I saw them go over to France, and I saw them live in the disparity of the trenches. And that's what I learned was the great thing about history, is that you can go back to a certain point in time and breathe new life into it. I tried to experience what these men felt, and in turn, I was graced with 19 new friends.